So I'm going to go through, this is a slide deck that I created for a webinar that we did a couple months ago with a Bray Connor from the NAACP. Her presentation on the webinar is absolutely fantastic, and it was a really rich Q&A. So I highly recommend y'all check out that full version as well. But we did felt like there's just a lot of useful information in here, and it might be worth just doing a revisiting of it. I'm going to move to the slides relatively quickly. I will go a little slower than I did in the original webinar. Please feel free as I'm talking to drop questions in the chat or even raise your hand. We can be somewhat informal with this. It is a lot of information. It's a little bit of a data center 101. I know a lot of us at this point know a lot about data centers, and so I tried to really focus it on some of the particular weirdness or strangeness of the way this industry works that's sort of different than the industries we might already be used to in the region. And with the lens of, if these are coming and you have one in your neighborhood coming, are there potential fixes to address some of these concerns? So you'll see a little bit of that. So hopefully it's not totally duplicative for folks who are already in this. Yeah, so this is just who we are. I think y'all, have you found us? You know who we are. So yeah, so what I just said, how are these hyperscale AI data centers different than what we might be used to? So there's all kinds of data centers. You'll see them like edge data centers, et cetera. For this purposes of this presentation, I like to keep things fairly simple. So I just have sort of traditional data centers versus the AI hyperscale, though there are further gradations between those definitions. But we've had data centers as long as we've had computers that could talk to each other, or even folks who were in offices in the 80s probably remember an in-office data center, right? That's not that new. What is new is the size and scale of the hyperscale AI data centers. And that is because of the way that generative AI works. So it works best when it has a bunch of other computers nearby that it can talk to and solve puzzles with. And so they want to have all these computers next to each other in these bigger and bigger spaces to more efficiently do that generative AI. So even as I understand it, even some AI work, like for example, the kind of AI that scientists use to identify whale songs across the ocean, they might have 10,000 recordings of whale sounds and they put them through this AI and kind of says, like, do these have meanings in different contexts? Like an AI can do that. That's not really generative AI, so it doesn't even use the same kind of the talk to each other cross computational technology. But the generative AI, this newer kind that's really exploding right now, does. And so that uses quite a lot more power than traditional data centers. And one of the reasons for that is because the process creates a lot more heat than traditional data processing. And so the more heat you create, all this stuff, it's like your phone. You set your phone on the car dashboard in the sun, and 30 seconds later, it's beeping at you. It's like it's overheated. It's not going to work anymore, right? Turns your camera off. The phone's too hot. So we've all seen that happen. So it's the same with these AI chips. They get hot, they can't work, and so they have to keep them cool. And also like different kinds work at different temperatures, things like that. So it's all very complicated. But the idea is that all of a sudden you have a new technology that one needs way more space and two needs way more cooling technology. And so you have kind of a blah blah blah. So you have a new situation that we didn't have before, which is why this all feels so new. This is just an example. This is from Indiana. And so you see Eli Lilly in blue here, which is a pharmaceutical company that we may be familiar with. I think of that as a very, very large company with a huge footprint in Indiana. And you can see that it's just a little baby compared to the size of these big tech companies, just to put in perspective how much wealth that these companies are working with. Also, fun fact, my brother put this slide deck through an AI critique, not with my permission. And it said that this slide was too controversial. So AI did not want you to see this slide. Anyway, so what do the data centers cost? I mean, just to know again, when I'm talking about this, like things suddenly feel like they're really big. They are. They got bigger. See, right there in the data. Um, this was interesting to me. This is from the same Reuters report or article. So, what does an AI data center cost specifically, and what are they spending the money on? And the reason I wanted to know the answer to this question was really because my question is, how likely are they to abandon these facilities in 5 to 10 years? And so if you look at it, 70% of the cost of the facility is in the chips and the data storage. Um, and we know, because the industry talks about it all the time, because it's a constraint for them that they're puzzling through, that a lot of these chips that are very, very expensive only have like a 5 to 10 year lifespan. And so looking at this chart for me, I have a couple takeaways. One, they can afford to pay communities more for their land and they can afford to pay their workers more to build it because that's a very small percentage of their overall cost is going into the building and land cost, which is at 11%. And then two, I am very worried if you have a facility that 11% of the cost is in the actual land, and then 70% is in the stuff that's in the building. When the stuff that's in the building is obsolete, I don't feel great about the likelihood that they're going to stick around. That just is what it is. And the wiring is every 7 years. Thank you, Erin. And if you have a source for that, it's probably just your personal knowledge, which is fine. I'm happy to incorporate that into my materials. So a couple of takeaways from this first section of the slide deck um, is that you do hear if you use a phone, you need hyperscale AI data centers. I really don't think that's true. I used a phone for a long time before generative AI existed. We all probably got phones in the early to mid, 2000s or 15 years ago. This technology in these data centers didn't exist when we got our phones and started using Facebook. So this is a relatively recent technology. And it's, the cat is a little bit out of the bag, but that doesn't mean we can't put a leash on the cat. I don't know what the metaphor is there. Y'all are welcome to toss some metaphors that work better in the chat. But so the other difference between kind of how things were and how things are now is that now rural communities are much more attractive to AI hyperscale developers than they would have been for traditional data centers. And so that now I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So historically, so this chart on the right is a little bit weird with all the dots, but this is the size of the plots of land that were purchased for data centers. And you can have the slide deck and look at this as close as you want, but the takeaway here is that the plots of land got a lot bigger starting in 2023. You start to see these plots get a lot bigger because they're buying more lands because this technology requires it. And then so more land, where do you find really large tracts of land? Rural areas. So historically, if you're going to build a data center, what are you thinking about? So you want access to a power source, grid reliability, and broadband interconnection, not necessarily things you're going to find in a rural area. You want proximity to demand. So the less distance your information has to travel, the less latency there is. So the faster that travels just is moving through space. And so we don't have that in a rural area, right? But then you move into where rural areas start to win, I guess, win economics. So that land becomes cheaper, governance may be easier to work with in a rural area, and then community support. And Angela, for the record, this is a somewhat random order. I did not put these in kind of a special order. That was just me, and it was arbitrary, but you're not wrong. Anyway, so just to say the bottom three are things that they might have assumed would be easier to tackle in a rural area. So just trying to figure out why now, why Appalachia, right? So historically, the majority of data centers are in the Northern Virginia area. And if you think about data location and latency, grid access, all those other things, Northern Virginia is a perfect place for all of those. And then you also see a lot, Texas, California, Illinois, Georgia, Ohio. So you don't really see some of our states on this list. This is pretty out of date. I did this in February, and then I went to capture a new snapshot of this map today, and there were so many that it was all blurry, and I decided to just stay with my February map. But the short answer is there's a lot. There's a lot. Um, so I'm going to walk through some of these types of concerns, and just some more. That sort of that. So that portion of it is just sort of like, what are they? Why are they happening now? Why are they coming here? And then just to walk through some of the specific considerations. Yeah, Kentucky has a bunch that are proposed, and they all look really different. The ones in Kentucky are they're very interesting to me. But we can talk about that after if you want. So let's talk about jobs. This is from Virginia Legislative Study, JLARC. It's 2024, which in data center timeline is like the Jurassic period, because things move so quickly. But it gets you some interesting. So the typical data center personnel on the bottom right, just to kind of lay that out. So you have facility managers, IT professionals, engineering and maintenance, and security. For what it's worth, I've seen some job training programs in the region that these are the sorts of permanent jobs that you see. And there are some, not all these require a college degree. And so there's some of the job workforce training programs in the region are starting to look at how can we scale people up for these positions that are going to probably be created. Just to give a sense of scale, since all these numbers are so big, it's a large, so this one is 1,000-acre, 4 million square foot AI data center in Abilene, Texas, is expected to employ 1 to 300 people, long term, and then 6,000 in construction. And then for context, a typical kind of supercenter Walmart employs 2 to 300 people. So you're looking at as much or slightly fewer jobs that are created in a Walmart, but obviously the footprint is a lot larger. And as could be pointed out, also the pay scale is probably higher than what you make in a Walmart. It's not 100% correlation, but just to give you a sense of like how many people that work at Walmart, it might be a similar number that you might know that work at a data center long term in a community. Yeah. So we had a great webinar in May about construction jobs where we really deep dove into construction jobs. If people want to talk about those, what those are, how to make sure that those jobs have high standards when they come, things like that. So that is what it is. I'll say that the data center industry has created a hugely surging demand for construction workers. It's created a lot of weirdness in the construction industry, but it's probably somewhat similar to what we saw during the fracking boom, as far as like people traveling for jobs, short-term stay for construction jobs on data centers, a lot of people traveling around, and is what it is. The last thing I'll say is that, and there was just a new study that came out that I got last week, and it was the week of 4th of July, and I did not read it, although I did put it on my list to read before this presentation. But right now, the job estimates vary really wildly, and we don't actually really have a great handle on how many jobs that we can expect or that they're creating. And so my estimates in this are based on a couple different data centers, for example, as examples, just because I wanted to know what it might be like. But it's a real point of growth for future research, honestly, and for communities to know, because a lot of them are making decisions about whether or not they want these without this really basic information on the job estimates and whether or not they're accurate. So regardless of whether or not the job estimates are accurate, we want them to be good, safe jobs. And we, in the construction webinar and in this slide, talk a little bit about some of those standards. But just for the sake of time, I'm going to talk a little bit about power use, which is also an area where there is a need for more research and a lot of question marks. But what we do know for sure is that they use a lot of power. Again, a lot of that power is going into cooling the equipment so that it can operate efficiently and not be damaged, because it has to be kept cool and the processes create tremendous amounts of heat. So this is another Indiana-focused one, but it has, some large industrial facilities in the region, engine testing, steel mill. is that one, an ethanol refinery, and comparing that to the electricity use. So again, that question of how do these hyperscale AI data centers vary from industries we're used to, they're very different. It's a different question. It's not the same as a steel mill. And then for me, I'm not an electricity expert. Um, so I was like, okay, what does that even mean? What is a megawatt? So a megawatt is 400 to 900 homes. A gigawatt is the power that you get from like a nuclear power plant or a really large gas power plant. And so that Indiana Amazon Web Services data center in the previous slide, that was that big red bar, is 2,200 megawatts or 1.5 million households, which is half the residential households in the state of Indiana. So it's a very significant change in the power dynamic landscape for the entire state and this one facility. And then there's the question of are they using the public utilities or the utility scale electricity, or are they getting electricity from utilities like the rest of us do when we're hooked up to the grid, or are they creating their own power? Right? Because both of those are options. And so what we're seeing is this Bloomberg estimate that there's 100 gigawatts of on-site gas burning capacity expected in the US. And so, as this number above says, 1 gigawatt is the size of a large gas powered plant. So we're really looking at just the scale of backup or of behind the meter is really significant. And one of the things just to note for me is when you look at, okay, well, we want them to use behind the meter power. So they're paying for their own power and they're not coming off the grid because that's costing consumers too much money. What's worth noting is if they're using natural gas or diesel fuels, or those are publicly traded commodities or market traded commodities, sorry. And so that means that the data centers, even if they're buying that, it's going to compete on the market and it is going to end up raising the price of natural gas because there's just so much more natural gas being used. And I mean, my takeaway from that is that all the more reason to push for renewable and battery backups, et cetera. And yeah, so and I see a request in the chat just to flag for the July 9th event for Lawyers for Good Government, if Molly or Liam could find that. Sorry. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. If you have any questions, feel free to drop those in the chat. Really great info in the chat. Thank you for folks who are contributing their knowledge as well. So data centers don't just use a lot of power, they use power in weird ways. So one, because their materials are so delicate and their operations have to be done in very delicate ways, they have a lot of safety backups, et cetera. And so one, they need these like really intensive on-site backups powers, ability to back up from the grid if they're using grid power. So the one way they do that a lot, or some of them are powering with diesel generators, and just to see diesel generators are really dirty. And so just an example from the Washington Post, this chart. So the pink, that's smaller, is a power station, a natural gas power station that is in the Northern Virginia region. And then the red is reported emissions from data centers largely using these diesel generators. So those are not, again, if you're looking at one coming to your community and they have this diesel generator as part of it, that's something I think to have a lot of concerns about. There are other ways to do that. You can do solar, renewable, and battery backups on site. And then the second really interesting or strange way that they use power, and if you want to deep dive into this, there's some really good podcasts I listen to, but they have these safety mechanisms where they might pull off the grid to prevent a surge that might damage their equipment and move to their backup power. But if they are all using the same safety mechanism algorithm, then they all pull off at once. And then you have these massive power surges that are happening that can create power outages. And so it's a little wonky in particular, but it did happen in Virginia last summer and is something that a lot of folks who are thinking about grid stability have a lot of concerns about. Those aren't the only ways that data centers are just really different from other entities. But there are two that really stick out to me as being relevant to the region. And then long term, I'm going to zoom past this, but there's a lot the long-term, like by 2030 estimates on data centers is pretty wild. A lot of power, a lot of power. So there's also, yeah, and thank you, Larissa, for the examples. So I want to talk a little bit about noise, which is very much related to the power. Most of the noise comes from that cooling equipment. Again, I'm not the kind of person who knows what a decibel is per se, but I know what a fridge sounds like, and I know what a vacuum cleaner sounds like, and I know what a lawnmower sounds like. And so I I put these examples in for y'all. And so a lot of like when you're looking at an ordinance for your area, if you have the ability to do ordinances, which I like folks in West Virginia don't really, sorry. Um, so the inside a data center, you're looking at up to 96 decibels, which is louder than a lawnmower. And the diesel generators are also particularly noisy. So makeshift power plants can also be noisy. So there's a lot of sources for noise. One of the takeaways here is that energy efficiency and more efficient cooling technology can reduce power load and noise. And that, it's just something, those definitely questions that communities want to ask. So I'll leave that at that. They use a lot of water. The water is also very mysterious. They're don't want you to know how much water they use, and there's a real lack of data on how much water these things are using. Um, but again, the water use is used to cool things, so it's used in evaporative cooling mostly, and so different technologies use different amounts of water. And there's some new studies on this that I really just haven't had time to read. One of the things that is interesting to me about the water use is if you're using evaporative cooling, the water that is discharged can have increased percentages of whatever pollutant is in the nearby water that it's pulling from. So there was an example in Oregon where there were some agricultural pollutants that were in the water that the data center was intaking to do evaporative cooling. And then once the water evaporated and they discharged the leftovers, it had a much higher percentage than the water they had initially brought in. And so I say this, if you grew up with a wood stove, and I guess I did, maybe no one else did. But maybe on your shower head, calcium can build up on that shower head over time. That's what you're seeing with this evaporative cooling. So the real question with pollution is kind of whatever is in the water nearby can end up at higher concentrations when the water is done with it. Thank you, Angela. So you have the water that's always boiling out on the wood stove to keep the area humidified. And for us, it had such a thick layer of calcium on that because the water was boiling out again and again and again. And that's what's happening with this evaporative cooling. So that made sense to me. Me and Angela might be the only ones who get a picture about that. But anyway, so the water there is a great, one of the things with water is that there's a lot of state level recommendations that we can look at for water use. Obviously, you can tackle water use at a site by site conversation, but I think for water utilities, et cetera, there's a lot of value in looking at state level regulations to make sure that each community isn't approaching all these questions as individuals, but instead maybe we kind of raise the floor for folks through some state level legislation. And so our folks at Climate Exchange have some great toolkits on the water use. So Rose talked about using an antifreeze-like substance instead of water. And so my understanding is that would be a closed loop system. And which is different than the evaporative cooling system. I don't have, somebody else could probably explain it better than me. But my understanding is you're not going to see that being disposed of as much as you are seeing maybe the disbursements of the water post evaporative cooling. And so the pollutants or whatever is in the closed loop cooling system, I'm not saying not to be concerned about it, but it is not a much of an ongoing like output concern that you see with a lot of facilities have like a daily discharge, right? And that's not what that would be. But yeah, sure. Where does it go? Yeah, that's is always the question. Where does it go when you're done with it? Always worth asking. Um, uh, yeah, and so Aaron has a note about heat transfer to heat greenhouses, et cetera. It's a whole we have a whole thing about waste heat. We talk about that a lot. Um, so tax revenue, I'm gonna skip past this like fairly quickly because I do want to just for sake of time. But the real through line here is that there are instances where communities have really benefited or been very happy with the deals that they got for data centers to contribute to the local tax base. It's a very real concern in Central Appalachia, where we have a lot of closed facilities that used to contribute to our tax base, and those maybe mines or power plants or steel mills, et cetera, are now closed. And the taxes that they paid that once went into our garbage pickup in our schools, we don't have that anymore. And so you have a lot of communities that are closing schools because they don't have the tax base. So it's a real question like, okay, this comes to town. Could this help us keep our schools open with the taxes they pay? And the real answer is honestly, maybe, because they're getting a lot of tax subsidies and tax handouts. Pam mentioned earlier that they're getting sales tax handouts. And so they're spending those millions of dollars on those chips, and they may or may not be paying taxes on those chips that they're buying. It's really uh not consistent and not transparent. And so you have this case study of Loudoun County, where on the whole, county officials have been extremely happy with the positive impact on their data centers on the taxes budget. And a lot of other places that have been very, very unhappy with the tax deals that were struck with data centers. Um, And Angela, I mean, to your question in the chat, I can't, I think it's just a complicated question, right? So anyway, the laws on tax revenue varies wildly from state to state, which is one of the reasons I'm going to kind of skip through it. But right now, there is a lot of legislation in all of the states where we work in that is looking at the issue of tax abatements and subsidies for data centers. And I think it was New Jersey that just passed a piece of legislation that was turning back just a couple-year-old, tax abatements or tax subsidies. So I would have to find that article. So I probably shouldn't have cited it unless someone has that New Jersey article handy. So you do see, I think there's a lot of pushback against these tax subsidies, but the through line here is that, geez, they sure should be paying taxes. Yeah. So here's what I said when I was here. The companies making money off data centers are the richest in human history. They can pay taxes. Um, so we talked a lot about land use and zoning considerations in our, I want to say, April webinar, which was focused on local government. We had speakers from different places who were looking into these. This really varies wildly from state to state, what is possible. And so states like Pennsylvania and to a certain extent, Ohio have a little bit more ability to do some of this land use zoning stuff than places like West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee. So we are going to have a webinar in August talking about NDAs. I feel like folks probably have a good understanding for that, but they are not great and they are legally dubious. Overall, we want transparency. And then we're going to have a webinar in September that's going to talk about supply chain. So what goes into a data center and can we make it here? Y'all, I know folks come to this from every side of the equation, but one industry that is particularly interesting to me is in battery manufacturing. So Appalachia in the South have a lot of strength in the battery manufacturing industry, and a lot of the issues I mentioned earlier with diesel generators, batteries have there's some really interesting new battery technology for these utility scale batteries. And some of them are being made in West Virginia. So there's actually a data center in Minnesota that is going to be using batteries that were made in West Virginia as their on-site power backup. So that is an opportunity to make data centers more sustainable, have less pollutants that could also create jobs in the region. And so we're going to be working with Catalyst Connection, who work with small and medium scale manufacturers in the region to think about, are there ways for the Appalachia manufacturers to be a part of the data center supply chain? Um, and then I will just kind of produce this. But the questions I've been asking throughout, what do you do with it when it's done? And what are we going to be responsible for? This is something I think that's not talked about enough. We're very used to companies coming, making a lot of money, and then leaving us with their trash. And if that is something that every community that's looking at a data center needs to be asking a lot of questions about, and ideally laying as many protections in place to protect against as possible. There's a lot of the road to these kinds of protections has actually been paved a lot with renewable energy. And so when a utility scale solar or utility scale wind is coming to town, there's often clauses put into place that say, in 20 or 30 years, when this technology is obsolete or needs replaced or upgraded, who's going to pay for it? Or maybe putting something in a fund in advance or having bonding to make sure that those sites are not abandoned when the windmills or solar panels are no longer functional. And so anyway, we know how to do that. We know how to protect communities against stranded assets like that, but we're not seeing those applied to data centers. So I'll leave it at that. But the other thing I mentioned here is this minimum contract duration. If you have to scale up your water system or your grid for a data center with this idea that they're going to be around for 10 years and paying taxes, it'll pay for itself, then they close in 3 years. Well, you've got 7 years of liability for a scale up that you didn't have to do. That was done for no use. And so the solution for that is you would have them contract to pay, whether or not they exist or not, those infrastructure costs that your community might experience from them for X amount of years, whether or not they stay open. And so there are answers to this, but you have to implement them and ask those questions. And I'll just leave it with, again, there are so many communities who are facing these questions in isolation as individuals, and they're all expected to solve them by themselves. And that's really not a fair way to do it. So the more we can get good state policy to raise the floor up for everybody is, one thing I'm really interested in talking about. So I will leave it at that, I think. I have a bunch of resources. Liam has been doing a wonderful job of sharing them in the chat. Sorry, this went on longer than I thought. We have,